Julie. She's been just wonderful. But that's for many, many years, not just for this moment. And also, it's nice to be back, if I have my voice. Julie said, this is a work in project. What I'm going to talk about mostly is a part of a historical, a chapter. And in that chapter, I asked the question, and maybe it's because of where I'm located in the university, how is it possible that people can think about ideas of useful and practical knowledge, and also teacher practice, which is what's sort of very, very important in teacher education, as a way of talking about change. So it's not about practice, because if those of you who read the science and technology studies, there's a whole what they call practical turn, understanding the practices of science. I am talking about a very particular way useful, practical knowledge sort of circulates in education, although I will only partially talk about education. How does it become possible to think that's a way of telling the truth about teachers, about schools, about nations, and so on? And so that's my first slide. If you know about the Lorelei, there's sort of a siren that sings and mariners go into the rocks. Well, in some way, practical knowledge, useful knowledge, is sort of like the siren singing. Everybody sort of goes in the rocks and think they're going to find salvation. And again, that's my question. Why is it? And the more you read, the more you realize it's not self-evident. And it's not something that's always been there. And so that's really the question I started with. And I shared the paper that's related to this with Fazil Rizvi, and he said, that's not history, it's philosophy. I think it's history, but I have some debates with people who are in history about what's history, so maybe that's part of it. But I'm going to talk about 4 points, or actually 3 points and then the fourth one. One, I'm going to talk about, and I'm using the Enlightenment as a way of understanding a particular kind of reason. Again, Fazil's not here. He's busy talking to politicians today. Otherwise, I would use his name in vain. He was talking about the Enlightenment as sort of the between rationalism and empiricism. And that's not important to what I'm going to say, because I think that what I'm going to say crosses both of them. I want to go back to cosmopolitanism as a way of thinking about how we begin to reason about everyday life, because it's a very interesting point where that becomes an object of scrutiny, first as philosophers and later in social science. And then I want to talk about the paradox of this idea of change that's embodied in the notion of practice. And that paradox is it's supposed to be talking about change, but it's about stability. And then the third point, which is also related to, and all these relate to the title, the impracticality, why I think it's impractical. If you think about the traveling of certain kinds of principles of the Enlightenment, they're built upon notions of a comparative thought, notions of different civilizations, and then later on you have things like eugenics. And that's brought into this notion of practice today. And that the very notion of practice and practical and useful knowledge carries in it its exclusions in its name of inclusion. And so I'm going to explore that as a historical phenomenon. Every once in a while I'll bring it back to the present. And then I'll end very quickly with why it's impractical, which I just gave you now, so I could stop now. All right. One of the responses people might say when you talk about, and I do talk about reason, is didn't people reason before? They did reason before. People reason since you begin to have at least language, at least you know it. But there are different ways people reason. And the reason I put this up, just as there's some really interesting semiotic literature on the conquest of Mexico, for example, and you probably, well, a whole bunch of different ones, which talked about how Cortez could come into Mexico with, I think, 60 soldiers and a lot of horses and conquer 1 million people. And so it wasn't that he overwhelmed them, but there was something about the way he could think about what he was doing that Montezuma and others didn't think that way. And it gave him access to things that They had access to other things, but particular things that made him be able to fight. The point is that one of the things about Columbus or Cortez, and you can see my North American location, is for them, the reason was if you could reason about God and recognize God there, you were reasoned and not a barbarian. If you couldn't find God, you were a barbarian. That's a form of reason. Rodin's statue of the thinker is my epitome of thinking of the cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan was a broad band of different kinds of things that emerge in the Enlightenment, which says that, and I'll get to this a little bit more, people have their own history. That history is different from nature and God. They know how to reason, and they know how to be rational about that, and they were two different things. And then if they did that, somehow they could think about both who they are, but who other people are, and also think about how you can intervene in human life versus God-given life or places of birth. So what the cosmopolitanism for me is a way in which you begin to change the way in which people reason about their world, but also who those people are. And so that's, and Rodin's statue is, to me, very much in that. The modern school, as much as I read about it, is built upon Enlightenment thought. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying it's one continuous thing, but there are certain things that begin to travel through it. And I also need to say now, so that I protect myself later, I am very much a child of the Enlightenment. All of us are. That's what you hear about, whether we recognize it historically or not. But what I'm talking about is a particular strand of the Enlightenment that moves into the present. Foucault has a very interesting, I think it's in the one he talks about Nietzsche genealogy, and I forgot the other, there's a third word there, where he says his critique is about the dogma of the Enlightenment, even though Foucault had the attitude of the Enlightenment. And in some ways, argument is an analytical argument that's historically bound, that's very much indebted to the Enlightenment, but in the critique of much of what I see goes into modern schooling. But not only modern schooling, that's where the social sciences. I'll get to this later. This is from Luxembourg. You have to write. All right. One of the things that happens in the latter part of the Enlightenment, and this quote from Immanuel Kant captures it, where he says, morality is not properly a doctrine in how we may make ourselves happy, but how we may make ourselves worthy of happiness. What happens in the 19th century is that you have a shift in science, but also you can see this in Kant, from trying to find a universal knowledge to focus on processes. And that's why he says make ourselves worthy. The worthy is a notion of process. And I'll get to that a little bit more because the whole element of time becomes very, very important in understanding the construction of the modern self. And what's interesting about the Enlightenment for me also is that it was supposed to supersede the nation, but all of our nations, at least the ones that I'm talking about here, are very much indebted to the insertion of Enlightenment thought into the construction of the modern citizen. The modern citizen is very much produced by the Enlightenment. All of the American founders were people who were very well versed in the Enlightenment, but brought it into political theory and the Republic and the whole idea of the citizen. And one of the things about the 19th century is the philosopher gets replaced with social science as a way of trying to improve society. I'll get to that also in a bit. And if you haven't seen this movie, it's a great movie. I think it's a Norwegian movie about Swedes going in the 1950s into Norway to try to understand how men work in the kitchen. And this is the ultimate faith of science in trying to sort of organize society in one way or another. I use this because it's a nice movie, but you could also read in the US the end of ideology debates and so on in the 50s. It was the same faith in the expertise that somehow would be able to solve all the problems, and politics and ideology were no longer of an issue. Now, one of the things for me, again, I'm saying for me, is that to understand the modern school, you have to understand this idea of cosmopolitan. One of the things about the formation of the modern high school in the US, initially they were going to call it the Cosmopolitan School, but they decided it sounded too elite, so they called it the Common School. And if you go back to Immanuel Kant, he was very much an elitist. I mean, he talked about knowledge and the philosopher as the guardian of society, in which you try to tutor people into what's morally good and so on. And so there isn't a certain elitism that gets democratized, doesn't get fully democratized, and that's where someone like Jacques Rancière becomes very interesting to read, because he talks about the hierarchy between those who know and those who don't. And his educational example is the ignorant schoolmaster. But what's interesting about this is a cover of a textbook in the 1930s in Luxembourg. And you have the family, you have the church, you have the state in the back, and then you have the school. And one way of thinking about the school is the way in which these things become assembled and connected. And they get assembled and connected in different times. I mean, in this time you wouldn't be talking about entrepreneurial, today you would be talking about it. But it still embodies in different ways, for me at least, when I think about it, certain premises that you begin to see visible in the Enlightenment. All right. Now, one of the things about, or at least that I've been thinking about, and this again to relate back to practice, is the idea of a certain kind of consciousness that emerges. Again, it isn't that people weren't conscious before of things, but it is a particular kind of way of thinking about who you are, how you relate to things, that appear, you begin to see appearing in the late 1700s, 1800s, and into the 21st century. I call it, it's not my name, although I'm using it differently than the people who use it, it's called the homeless mind. What do I mean by homeless? You think of abstractions like society. And in that notion of abstraction, you then begin also a way of relating it back to yourself. So you're thinking of yourself as a member of society, the idea of a citizen, the idea of learner, all have this homeless mind. Homeless in the sense, when you think of these words, they have no physical attachment to them. They have no place near you. But there are also ways in which you bring into you to think about who you are. And the moral order in which you live in. And social science is really very good at that, because you have all sorts, and I'll get to it a little later, all sorts of languages which are abstractions about what it means to be human that then loop into daily life as a way of organizing with daily life. By the way, this is, I'm smiling, it's a new material argument, but not Barad's. And so one of the things about this notion of reason, it's not just a way of applying something, it's a way of being. Lorraine Daston has actually a very nice article about the whole notion of observation. You know, I'm looking around people taking notes. And she starts in the 1600s how people went into a room and took notes. But when they took notes, it was random thoughts. There's no way of systematizing or thinking that you're somehow capturing something that's real, that's happening outside of you. But with this way of thinking, what I'm calling the homeless mind, you begin to create distant things and bring them into you. And that's the next slide. Aha. A poem. And this was not only science. Jacques Rancière actually did write something on aesthetics, and he's talking about how when in ancient Greece, when you wrote a poem, the idea was rhetorical and had no notion of metaphor. A metaphor is a way of thinking of analogies between yourself and distant things. That the idea of the poem was a way of locating a space where the orator was speaking, but it wasn't metaphorical. It was actually, they were metonyms in some ways. And modern poem is a whole different type of experience. A modern poem, you can talk about the cloud, you can sing the national anthem. These give you a way of thinking about distant things, nation, weather, as a way it becomes expressing emotion and personality. And this is part of that homeless mind, this idea of human abstractions, and this is where human history comes in. become a way of thinking about who you are, what you should be, that also collectively puts you with other people, which is different than earlier notions. I mean, the idea of the modern state is a way of thinking about how you have collective memory and also collective belonging and home. And so part of what happens is this idea of the homeless mind, or where you begin to think about not only distant things, but how you can bring that into daily life and also change that life. That is where I think the next thing comes in. You could read, these are all, Google image is very funny, so you can read them. All right. One of the ways in which things become apparent as a form of intervention is the idea, first, of human history. I can't tell you how many people tell me, well, what do you mean human history? The Greeks had history. If you read Herodotus, he's not talking about human history, okay? He's trying to glorify the Caesar through the way he writes his tales. The idea of human history is something that begins to appear in the 18th century. It may be there before, but the idea that people had their own history, separate from nature and separate from God, is something that is really fairly recent. And the reason I put the pyramids there, because there's a very nice, I think it's there. One of my former graduate students told me he couldn't find it, but I trust me. And it's the pyramids. Before you had a notion of history, people would ride on camels past the pyramids and they would write graffiti. Why? Because there was not a way of thinking about the pyramids in a sense of time in which you had a relationship between past, present, and future. By the middle of the 1700s, you begin to write what's called modern history. And in that, you can begin to see in the pyramids the beginning of Western civilization, for example, which is how I was taught Western history. And you can begin to see this relationship in which time becomes very important, because it becomes a social time and a cultural time, not just a regular time. And it also gives it a regularity. And so this idea of time is also a way in which you begin to also reconstruct the notion of memory. Again, it's not that people didn't remember and didn't before, but there's a particular way in which you begin to remember. That's what your museums do. That's what your statues do. It's a very external kind of memory, which is built in the present to bring back the past, but not in the way in which tradition did it in previous ways of thinking. And so human history becomes very important. And there's a very nice book by, I think it's called Strange Dislocations by Stedman, where she says and talks about the formation of history, but at the same time, but not connected, was the formation of modern psychology, where you begin to think of the internalization and the interior of the self as having dimensions of time. So you can begin thinking about things like development and growth, which were not possible before. And one example of this is the table. Prior to modern history, the table, and actually Foucault wrote about this, but other people have as well. The table, everything was there fixed. They were there for eternity. And when the invention of modern history, this idea of the table begins to shift, where you have a past and a present, and you can think things moving, and you have whole notions of uncertainty and so on that go with it. The other thing is you also have, and that's why I put Wedgwood. Do all of you know what Wedgwood is? I have to say that, I said this the other day when I was in Queensland. I have a lot of Asian students, and none of them, and most of them, even the Americans, didn't know what Wedgwood was. Anyway, Wedgwood is a very interesting story. It was the name of a person. He owned a factory in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And one of the things about the factory is it became a way of talking about improvement. And you begin to see in the way Wedgwood talked how the idea of social improvement becomes possible. And what's really interesting to me, because I read things today about the factory, which isn't the same as what Wedgwood, both socialists and capitalists picked up the factory as a utopic way of thinking. It was a way of bringing some desired future through the organization of a factory. But also in that is this discourse of improvement, that somehow you can intervene in social life and begin in that intervention, bring about something that you desire. And this, it's interesting to me because when I read utopian thought, this is not utopian thought, but it is utopic. You see this, even though you're losing the top of it, but that's okay, I can read it. The top says social science, salvation themes, and designing everyday life and people. I mean, one of the things implicit in what I'm saying is that the very idea of intervening in planning, which is part of the modern state and part of the modern school, is this idea of social improvement. Social improvement itself is a notion, it's some salvation theme. I'm not going to go too much into it, but there's been a lot written about education and salvation themes. That is, and they're different. One of my students did a dissertation on the way in which the Argentinian Republic formed through inserting particular kind of Catholic salvation themes into the idea of what the citizen was in the Republic. And there's a lot of work done in the US about Calvinism, and Daniel Chola does it in relationship to Lutheranism in Europe. And there are people who are working, and you can't call it, well, they're not salvation themes in the terms of the West, but if you think of China, it's a whole notion of morality and Confucianism have in it what we would call in the West salvation themes. So this idea of improvement, this idea of somehow changing everyday life, is involved not only with the idea you want to help people, it also is involved with some notion of the future that in the present becomes a governing theme. And one of the things about the early social sciences, which is, again, interesting to me, although I'm using Dewey, it's not only Dewey, is that it was about designing people. They didn't often use the word, or sometimes they did, and they also used the word soul. Later on it becomes mind because it sounds more scientific, mind, but when you're talking about changing the mind, when I came into the building, I was very interested in the motto of Melbourne, which says shaping minds and shaping the world. That comes out of this stuff, that somehow if you plan properly and you have the right way of reasoning about people and the process, remember time, you have a way of redesigning who they are. And the whole notion of design, which I actually looked into because I was interested in it, I mean, you can talk about it today, it's very common. If you read the educational researcher, they're continually talking about design research, for example. The whole notion of design comes out of theology. It's not a secular word. It becomes secularized, but it's a theological word to begin with. And if you look at the turn of the century, and most of what I'm talking about here, although it's, I could easily give you European examples and probably some from Australia, but I'm not that well versed in Australian social science. The social sciences were a panacea for finding equality. Almost all of the American social science that relates to education was concerned with what today we call urban education or urban conditions. And again, for me, the more I read it, it's really interesting because that urban is today now still very prominent, but very few people think of it historically. And it had to do with deviance, with people who were, they didn't use the word pathological, but they were different from the normal. And the idea was, how do you recognize the people who are coming into American cities? And how do you change their conditions, but also change them? Now, some of this was important. I mean, they brought sewers into the houses so that you didn't have to throw your garbage out the window. You have it here, you have public transportation so that people can get to work and you don't have a lot of horses walking around on the street and they leave their stuff around. You have to teach, and this is the domestic science movement, which was in Australia, but also in the US and also through Europe. You had people who had to teach people who came to the city and didn't know how to manage a checkbook because they got paid Monday and they had to make the money last to the following Monday. I mean, those are things that the rationalization of the home, if you want, mostly that was gendered. And so the social sciences were very much concerned not with the elite, but with the people who somehow were different. And it's also interesting in reading John Dewey, and I like John Dewey, fine guy. My uncle took a course with him, so I have to like him. When he spoke about democracy, and he spoke about reasoning, how people should reason, he used other words like action, intelligent action, and so on. He also used the word revelation, that democracy was a form of revelation. And it's interesting his use of the word, because in the text itself you can't trace it. But if you read around the religious debates at that time, the issue of revelation was a very important word being used, which Dewey picked up in his text. It's also, Dewey worked at the University of Chicago, and the president, that's where his laboratory school was. And his laboratory school, the reason it was a laboratory school was also very interesting, because this is the idea of science. In the university, they were setting up laboratories for biology, for chemistry, for physics. And a way in which to get money to set up Dewey's school was to say it's just as much a science as these places. That's why it's called a laboratory school. I mean, you can use the word any way you want, but it was interesting, the choice of words in what became sort of high status knowledge. But anyway, Harper, who was the president of the University of Chicago, called the university the priest, the shaping of the minds and shaping the world. And it's also interesting, the University of Chicago, there was a debate when they were thinking about where to put it. It was formed by the Baptist Society, by the way. So again, you can see that how religion plays an indirect and sometimes direct role in collective thinking sometimes. And the debate was, should you put it in the suburbs of Chicago or put it in the center? If you know where University of Chicago is, right in the center. And there was no real, I couldn't find any real discussion of it, except I had to think of two things. First of all, the idea of the cosmopolitan is an urbane person. Where are your museums? Where are your concert halls? They're in the city. That's the cosmopolitan. And so you put a university in a city. At the same time, when that was built, the city was also a place of problems. You had all the immigrations and so on. I don't know if you know, but Chicago has the second largest Polish city in the world. It also at one point was the second largest Greek city in the world. And there was another group, I forgot which one, someone was telling me also. And so you had all these people coming in that the university was going to be the priest to. And that's Harper's word. I mean, he was using it in a benevolent way, but still the analogy of the language is very important. All right. And one of the things, and the reason I put this, they were not only concerned with, I mean, we have nice language in education. We talk about kids learning, we talk about helping them. In the current literature, we talk about teaching being a profession because it's helping for human improvement, and this is the language that's used. But they also were concerned very much with how do you change people's life so that, which also meant that their life that they were living was not the one you wanted them to live. And it was very interesting. One of the things I looked at was the sociology of community and the sociology that had to do with primary life. What they did is they took, this goes back to this idea of the homeless mind. They took German social theory about community and society. Society is an abstraction that appears in the 1700s, okay? Before that, a society was like a guild. It was people who got together, and then all of a sudden it begins to appear as an abstraction about how you think about how people get together. All right, and the Germans were very worried about this, and they talked about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And they also talked about the pastoral community. The notion of community itself also you have to think about in terms of its religious relationship. And what the Chicago sociologists did was bring in this idea of society and this idea of the pastoral and tried to urbanize it. And that's where ideas of George Herbert Mead and I think Ward and a whole group of other sociologists at that point begin to deal with this question of how do you reestablish solidarity, collectivity in the home as a way of also thinking about the society itself. Now, just as another example in this, and make sure I stay within my time so the rest of the day goes, the idea of the family has always been a way of thinking about collective belonging. The king used to talk of himself as the father of the nation, as the father is of the family. So this idea of trying to redo the family in urban settings was not, in a way, unusual historically, but a lot of these social theories were trying to take pastoral notions that had to do also with religious collective belief and bring it into the city where those conditions didn't apply anymore. So one way of reading early sociology is understanding both the tensions that were occurring, but also the way of trying to reestablish and change the home, i.e. change everyday life. And in a sense, while they don't use the word practice or useful knowledge, it becomes a way of thinking about how you change people through their daily interactions, through their modes of communication, all the things we now take for granted. All right, the paradox. I'll try to do this not too fast. I'll do it fast. One of the things that's in this, so we have the notion of history becomes a way of thinking about people. And in that, how do we think also about how we change the interior of people, i.e. the soul becomes the mind. But also you have in it what someone called the old metaphysics. Carl Becker wrote a book in 1932. He was actually a Wisconsin historian. And it was called The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers. And his argument is basically that what you had in the Enlightenment is you took God and you brought him into the city of, he called it a city of man, city of people, and called it nature. But he said the same epistemology is there. There's something that's given. There's something that's certain. And in that, you then begin to deal with issues of process. So the process becomes the uncertainty, but the certainty is that there's some nature to the child, some nature to the teacher, some nature to the family that you try to sort of design to get to. And I'm not going to talk about it today, but if you look at current research on teacher practice, that assumes that there is a nature to the teacher. And it's a desired nature that's in the abstraction, whether you call it the authentic teacher, whether you call it the expert teacher, or whatever. Those notions are abstractions about desires. And they function as an ontological certainty, to which the process is, and again, if I use today's research, the process is the stages you get to that. So if you look at a lot of the research, and also look at PISA, by the way. PISA also uses notions of certainty, but in a different way. But if you look at the classroom research that's done on teacher practice, it has this notion that there is this desire that somehow you have to get. And most of the psychological theories are processes to get to that desire. And once in a while you find in the literature where people actually recognize there's a theory and back this, i.e. an abstraction, but usually people treat practice as something that has an ontological realism to it. Okay. Now, back into this idea of certainty, but into the 19th century. One of the things about this idea of stability, which is tied to certainty, is that in the 19th century, people look to neoclassical art. You see it a lot around Melbourne, but I can see it in Madison, in the capital. And why do they go to the neoclassical art? One of the reasons they went is it gives a sense of stability and a sense of order from which you can deal and try to change the present. And if you think of Descartes, when he talks about progress and order, you have that even built into philosophy. And then you also begin to get the notions of system, which is very, very prominent today in almost every research. I mean, pick up the latest issue, again, of the Educational Researcher. There's an article by B.Y.R. He's the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Read his article. It's all about systems thought. He doesn't use the word, but it's about the system is trying to understand how different things interrelate into some whole, and that whole has a functional purpose of producing some desired end. And so he'll talk about what you have to do with teachers, what you have to do in classrooms, what you have to do with school leadership, and it's all part of this notion of system. And the other was, there was another article in there also. Wasn't Linda Darling Hammond, although she also uses this notion of system without giving it. Now, you also have, I put here the idea of survey, because the idea of survey captures this as well. In the 1700s, the survey was, again, something where you placed on tables. And then by the end of the 1800s, you begin to see surveys having a sense of time in it. And that it is to displace the past to get to the present, but the present is also something that has a fixed sense, or I'll call it an ontological sense. All right. Here I just want to deal with the question of measurement, because this also is a 19th century kind of thing that becomes prominent. And the random assignment, which you all probably know in terms of current educational policy, want, scientific evidence and useful knowledge. Anyway, one of the interesting things about this, and I'm going to switch to the next one, they both deal with process, going back to what I was saying before, which then assumes that the process is about something that's already there. So if you follow this process, then somehow you're going to be able to change something. And one of the things about this idea of experiment and also its notion of system, in the 19th century, it was mostly a mechanical notion. After World War II, it becomes, they draw upon biological metaphors. And cybernetics, which is also relates to biological metaphors too. But it's not only, which is interesting, even though today the notion of system uses biology as its way of thinking, it's also built upon certain notions of certainty. That is, if you look at, its object is already assumed. It's in the representations and identities that are given. All right, but what I wanted to do was just take from, you can't read the top, I'll read it. But Astrid Schrader, who does work in, actually, interesting, for me, interesting work, both looking at biology and also looking at physics. And she was talking about the design of measurement, which is what the top line says. And she says the way we measure is we separate the human from what's being measured as two separate things. And then in the measurement, we insert a notion of time as a way of erasing time. So you have pre and post tests, which was in the bottom. And she says, and I'll read because I like reading, information acquisition becomes a copying mechanism to give a special ontological presence to the objects of nature. She's talking about physics, okay? Nature's objects are established to measure the before and after, there's your process in time, of the experiment in the irreversible time of becoming. The measurement practices give a materiality to time as a feature of the experiment. And she argues that why that's not appropriate, why you have to filter in the measurement people themselves. And in a way, when you think of it, and at least when I talk to people in biology, for example, they filter it into the experiment. They filter in what they're doing as part of the experiment and part of the measurement. But then they have to devise ways of also filtering out to know how it deals back to reality, because what they do in the experiment is not reality. It's an artificial creation of something. All right, so all of this says, both in measurement, in the way we think about systems and so on, we insert a certainty as a way of thinking about change, so that when we talk about practice, we're talking about something that already has in it its contemporary framework built into it, that's stabilizing what it's talking about is changing. All right, the last point, and I'll try to do this not too faster. I said this a little bit before, but one of the things, and I'll use American progressivism here. American progressivism was a social movement. It was actually part of a broader social movement. The schools were part of it, by the way, which was called the social question. How do you begin to create a society that deals with all of the trauma that's being produced by a whole range of things? Usually we talk about industrialization, and usually we talk about urbanization, But I mentioned it before. I mean, if you're living in a house and you don't have running water, you're going to have a lot of disease. If you don't have ways of controlling disease, you have to begin to organize society and organize people. And much of the social sciences were concerned with that, I'll say urban. I did a study of urban and rural schools, and it was really interesting to me in the US. And we went around, and what was interesting to me is that when you went to rural schools, they used the same distinctions about kids that I found in urban schools. And you begin to realize, at least in American schools and its use of science, that it's a particular language that's developed in urban conditions that then get used in rural conditions that are not about the geography. It's about the cultural way you create spaces for people. So the early social science, that's why Chicago, New York were central places. They were dealing with these urban conditions, and they were dealing with the social, what's called the social question. The social question was something that moved through North America and moved through Europe, Northern Europe. It was a Protestant reform movement. All right, and you could read some of this, what I'm talking about, in just the title of the book of G. Stanley Hall. What does it say? I have to look over here. Again, you could see that the psychology that he's talking about, by the way, Hall was interesting. He wanted psychology to replace moral philosophy as the arbiter of the Bible. He also was very interested in schools, because schools were developing, and he can place his graduate students in schools at that time because there were no jobs for psychologists. And what's also interesting, at that point, educational psychology was of a higher value than psychology. Today, that's just the opposite. All right, so what's the title of his book? Adolescence. Adolescence is a way of thinking about kids. All right, it's a word that's been around, but he's using it in a very particular way, very particular reasoning. And what he's saying is that there are kids going to school. He called it the urban hothouse. Again, you have, it's really interesting to read if you read his language historically, not just to say what he's saying. And so adolescence was to deal with this transition from being a child to being an adult. And why does he want to do it? Because these kids who are coming to school aren't the kids who used to go to school. And so you can see how this idea of changing people and particular kinds of people begins even in the title. Because what's the title? Adolescence, it's psychology, because he's arguing for psychology as sort of the major discipline. It's relations to physiology, okay. And a lot of people have written about medicine, so it's not, we know that even physiology becomes not just physiology, it also becomes a way of morally thinking. Anthropology, sociology, and then you have what this relates to. Sex, crime, and religion. And the last one is us, education. And so you can begin to see how these social sciences begin to have some sense of who the child should be, and who they hope the child should be, but also who the child's not. And so you begin to have what I call double gestures. And it's interesting to read even contemporary literature. When I talk about double gestures, it's a sense of going this way and that way. You continually, I find, in reading texts, because I've become sensitive to it, there's a hope that if you do this, you're going to have a good citizen, you're going to have a good worker, you're going to have a better society. At the same moment next to it, it's talking about the kids who take drugs, or the kids who aren't behaving, or delinquent, and you begin to have these two gestures, the hope and the fear, together. And this, by the way, is something that you also begin to see emerge. I'll use the core of the Enlightenment, which was in the Renaissance, but moves up into the Enlightenment, which was the core of the ancients. The modern and the ancients was a long-standing debate around, and it was a book. And basically was saying, are we building ourselves on the people who preceded us, or have we superseded them? And the superseding won. I mean, that's, if you think about much of our modern society, we look at the past so we don't redo it, okay? Which means looking to the future. At the same moment, in that idea of superseding, you begin to have a way of thinking comparatively what the past was, what the future was. That's a new way of thinking. The Greeks never thought about the future. If they did, they thought they were accused of having hubris, because the only people who could think about the future were the gods. In the church, you had a universal history, so you didn't really worry about the future except that which was given in that universal history. So this idea of comparativeness is part of the construction of the invention of what we call today modern history. And so you begin to have this idea of comparison. Have we superseded the past, or are we better? But also that comparison, and you can see it from Linnaeus into Darwin, begins also to deal with human characteristics. So you can begin to talk about civilizations and place them on a hierarchy. And you know who are the advanced hierarchies. And so you begin to have this whole notion of comparison, which is built into this. Okay, it becomes a way of thinking. My most common example is today when I read research about kids who don't succeed in school. What do they say? They're not motivated. They lack motivation. They lack self-esteem. Now, the minute you imply those words, you're also implying something that's called motivation and esteem. That's a comparative mode of thinking. And it's built into this idea of representation and identity and this idea of certainty. Okay? If with that certainty, then you can say what's comparison to it, even though you don't use the word certainty. All right. Now, what's also interesting, and this is just a sidelight, originally in the Enlightenment, people thought the philosopher was the ultimate interpreter. And one of the things about the Enlightenment, by the way, was the philosopher began to see themselves as intervening between what society should be and also what society. They had a whole different notion of what knowledge was. That notion of the philosopher as the arbiter of what's good and what should be is replaced by sociology, psychology, and education, and maybe also anthropology. And so by the end of there's a very nice, I'm smiling because David Goodman is an American historian in Australia who writes in Australia, and the guy I'm going to mention is a Danish historian who also does American history. So there are very few American historians who do American history. His name is David Nye, and he wrote a book called The Technological Sublime. And in that book he says what happens in the 19th century, late 19th century, is that science and technology becomes a piece of reason itself. Remember I said earlier, you had reason, which was wisdom, morality, and then rationality. By the end of the 19th century, those distinctions disappear and you talk about science. And so when people look at the Empire State Building, or they look at Niagara Falls, or they look at the telegraph, or they look at electricity, or they look at the railroads, they don't see only technology. They see the ultimate expression of human wisdom. And it gets built into the construction of the nation. And his book is about how that happens in the US. I have to say this, it was not only in the US, because when I go to Scandinavia, and that was back to that other movie, Kitchen Stories, you still see the same notions. Science is a way in which you begin to think about social improvement and also the desire for what you want as a future, the whole notion of progress. I'm not going where's Julie? I should stop now. Yeah, all right. You could see how this gets built into also curriculum studies. I had this discussion, I forgot with who, about when you go into the school, you think you're teaching math, science, mathematics, science, music. But if you look at the origins of these disciplines in the school, they had nothing to do with those subjects. Music, I'll use music, but I can also go to math if you want, and I can also go to science, but I won't. This was studies, music came into the school in the late 1800s. It was brought in from, the Germans had it, and Americans saw it and wanted to bring it into school. Why? It was brought into Boston. Why Boston? You had a lot of Irish immigrants. The Irish immigrants, the girls were having problems, disease. Remember, the city was not a healthy place. If you sing, what does it do? You breathe in and out and so on. And that was supposedly a way of bringing health. And later on, you have something called music appreciation. Why music appreciation? It's a way of developing collective solidarity. It isn't what you do in a conservatory. So the school music is not a conservatory music. You could do the same thing in now, it also, and this is why I'm doing it now, this is called Seashore in the University of Iowa. And he's doing experiments on music, and people did experiments by looking at their students in their university class, because they didn't go out to schools. Psychology, up until after World War II, was really built upon professors making the students sort of be subjects in their research. Anyway, the idea was for Seashore that if you listen to jazz was an African-American music, and just what it says there, it was causing disease in young girls and society as a whole. And what he did was he photographed these people and watched their expressions as they listened to classical music and they listened to jazz. You can imagine which is, I don't, when I look at the pictures, I really can't see it, but somehow we saw the people who listened to jazz had these sour looks on their face, and when they listened to classical music, they were happy, all right? But also, you begin to develop a vocabulary about, and this is from that time, the child who didn't learn the music. He was distracted, a drifter, a name caller, a gang joiner, a juvenile offender, a joke maker, I'd be in trouble, a pretentious religious fanatic, and having acute emotional stress and an intense interest in sex. This is all for listening to jazz. So you can begin to see how, again, how these double gestures begin to work in trying to sort of understand, in a sense, the normality, but in that normality is also some notion of pathology. All right. I was going to talk about the sociology. I won't say very much, except the invention of the idea. In the US, the black male is an endangered species. All right. He's someone who causes trouble because he doesn't have a good family life. He leaves the family, doesn't take care of the kids, and so on. And this appears in the 1920s and then moves its way, over different periods, the characteristics of the black male shift. But it's always, it's a pathological, until today. Today it's not pathological. Today, he's a positive, soulful, and adaptive male. But still, it's based upon some notion of distinguishing the black male from other kinds of people. All right, I'm going to finish now. There are two kinds of questions that you could ask a lot more. What are the impracticalities of practical research? And I think hopefully you've begun to at least get some sense of some of the things that if you take these themes and put them into a way of examining, they won't be the same as the historical ones, but they're still present and in a sense still constructing these double gestures. The salvation narratives. About social improvement, which means the idea is how do you design people? They embody a comparative way of reasoning which differentiates and creates what I call the double gestures. And so the very efforts to try to create inclusion produces exclusion. And this has nothing to do with intent. I'm talking about the systems of reason and how they operate. There's a very, for me, it's a whole bunch of, in philosophy, but also in science studies about how theories act, that you can't just think humans are actors. In a way, I'm thinking about how systems of reason become an actor, in a way of organizing what's possible and not possible to think. It doesn't mean there aren't holes in it, but it means that it's just not there to describe things. And so, the question, all that, these are the impracticalities, and then the question which, for me, is why consider the past and the present? And to me, it's to poke holes in the causality of the present. So you can begin to think about other ways, or possibilities of other ways. It doesn't mean you throw everything out, but at least you have a way of questioning. It's another way of thinking about what's practical, I guess. So anyway, I'm going to stop.